Good evening. I'm David Wheeler, Conserve Wildlife Foundation's Executive Director. And I'm here to speak to you tonight about a creature that I consider to be the symbol of the wilderness here in New Jersey, the bobcat. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about a number of features having to do with the bobcat and our relationship with the bobcat here in New Jersey. But first, I want to just introduce my organization and myself. I have been the executive director with Conserve Wildlife Foundation for the past 8 years. Previously, I taught environmental communications at Rutgers University, and I also am the author of the book Wild New Jersey: Nature Adventures in the Garden State. And our organization is a nonprofit that works to protect rare wildlife and at-risk wildlife in New Jersey and beyond. And for the last 20 years, our biologists have been leading the way on a number of incredible projects, both recovering endangered wildlife, species that now are fairly commonplace to see, like the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the osprey. And the bobcat, in its own way, is among the success stories of wildlife species that have really come back from the brink of extinction or extirpation here in New Jersey. On the other side of the coin, we have a number of species where we're allowing to hang on through the work of our biologists. We're doing everything we can to help these species hang on, and they are a number of species and families of species in sharp declines, and that's some of the bat species we work with, golden wing warbler, some of the coastal species that we've seen rapid declines over the last few decades, and we're doing everything we can to stem off losing these species entirely. And our biologists work through everything from habitat restoration to surveys and monitoring and banding species, to working with teams of volunteers to track species as well. And so all of this goes into our work here at Conserve Wildlife Foundation. And I wanted to start with the story of an individual bobcat, a bobcat whose story in many ways symbolizes the story of bobcats as a whole. And this was a bobcat nicknamed BC, very creative. If you haven't picked up, BC is short for bobcat. Whoever came up with that, genius, unbelievable to think of that on the spot. But anyway, this bobcat, this individual bobcat, nicknamed BC by the media, was unfortunately struck by a car, as is all too commonplace for bobcats and many of our land terrestrial mammals here in New Jersey. This bobcat was hit by a car up on a lonely mountain road up in northwestern New Jersey. And had it not been for the screech of the tires just before impact, and it being close enough to a house where the homeowner not only heard it, but then alertly ran out, saw the injured bobcat by the side of the road, and was able to ultimately get in touch with a animal control who put them in touch with somebody who was able to get the bobcat to a veterinarian, a medical expert who was able to ultimately rescue this bobcat. Had it not been for the quick thinking of that homeowner, we would have absolutely lost the bobcat. And we know that because the injuries sustained were dramatic. The bobcat suffered a concussion. The bobcat had uh, multiple breaks in its legs. Um, it would have probably died within a few hours had it not been treated. As it was only through expert veterinary care, emergency surgery, of course, and then a lengthy and grueling rehabilitation that ultimately this bobcat was able to be rehabilitated through the work of Woodlands Wildlife Refuge, who is our uh, only rehabilitator in the state who's enabled to treat bobcats as a threatened and endangered species here in New Jersey, and as a mammal that with they have special regulations as to who's allowed to treat bobcats. And this bobcat was injured to such a degree that the surgery had to ultimately put in plates, pins, screws, all these things to immobilize, to fix and then immobilize the leg. And then through the rehabilitation, that bobcat was ultimately able to get back to a point where both the state biologist you see on the right, Gretchen Fowles, who's the lead for the bobcat program at the State Endangered and Non-Game Species Program, and Tracy Lever, who's with the Woodlands Wildlife Refuge, who runs that. organization. They felt comfortable roughly 5, 6 months after that accident in trying to release the bobcat out in the wild. And I myself was fortunate enough to attend, along with a number of reporters and photographers. We were out at Wawayanda State Park, one of the most gorgeous and picturesque and rugged places in the whole state. And they brought the bobcat out in this exclosure. They ultimately had they pulled up the gate you see there on the top. Not even a gate; it's a wooden panel on the put it on the top of the equivalent of a dog house, so the bobcat could run free. Here you see that moment where the bobcat looked out for the first time, seeing a truly wild setting for the first time in probably close to 6 months since its injury. And if any of you out there have a cat at home or have ever had a pet house cat, you might know that all too well that cats ultimately do whatever it is that they want to do. The second you try to get a cat to do what you want to do, they have other ideas. And nonetheless, bobcats, while different in so many ways, share that affinity for going their own way. And so that wooden panel was pulled out. The bobcat looked around, saw a bunch of crazy photographers. We were at a nice safe remove, and this was pre-COVID. We were at plenty of a safe distance, but nonetheless, bobcat then went back in the house there, and it felt for us like it was about 2 hours waiting for that cat to finally emerge. Would it even run free after all this? After this incredible success story with the bobcat ultimately returned to the wild. And it was probably about 4 minutes, but it felt, forever. And when the bobcat was good and ready, what did the bobcat do? It took off out of that and shot like a bullet up the mountain trail. Within about a second and a half, it was out of our sight. Absolutely stunning, and took my breath away, and a moment I will never forget. And it's amazing for me that I did get to see that. It's the only time I've ever seen a bobcat in the wild, even though it was, part not in the wild and part in the wild, maybe a second later in the wild. And the only time I've seen it, I've been out in the wild for tons of time my whole life. Some of the biologists who study bobcats in the wild have remarked that for decades, their only actual encounter was when they were called in for a trapped or injured bobcat, a bobcat caught in a trap, not intended for a bobcat, but caught nonetheless. So, in other words, kind of these freak occurrences, fluke occurrences, as opposed to just seeing one in the wild. They're very elusive that way, and they stay out of our sight. Nonetheless, people do get lucky every so often and see one comfortably in the wild, and to them, I am very jealous. And this gives you an idea, again, from this is Mackenzie Hall, a biologist with the Endangered Non-Game Species Program here in New Jersey, previously with Conserve Wildlife Foundation. And this is somebody who's had been working with with bobcats for years. I was tracking rattlesnakes poised up on a knoll covered in mountain laurel when I saw something in the distance. All of a sudden, it became clear it was a bobcat. And as it got 50, 40, 30 feet away, I saw it had a fresh kill in its mouth, a rabbit. It just looked at me and changed its course ever so slightly. It didn't stop suddenly or run away. It really is a symbol of the wilderness. Two things jump out at me. Of course, first, that great image of the bobcat noticing the person in the wild in a place where it would never see people, typically, probably about as remote an area as it gets, and not suddenly stopping short or dropping the rabbit that it had caught or anything like that, but just suddenly and subtly shifting its path just the slightest. Again, this is an animal that the wild, in a sense, belongs to the bobcat, and that's the feeling I got from that quote. The second thing, of course, from that quote is any quote where the throwaway line is, "Oh, by the way, I was tracking rattlesnakes," is tells you quite a bit about the kind of work that biologists do in the field. So I'm going to start with a few encounters that kind of run the gamut, but also kind of give a look into people's interaction with bobcats, how we perceive them, and how we hear hear about them primarily. Um, this is the most common way we hear about bobcats in the news or online. This is an encounter in Mercer County, in Ewing Township, a suburban area just out of Trenton. A bobcat was reported seen and here taken a photo of in an office park. The news reported it. It spent the day going through the various local and state news, and uh, and then they realized a day later, roughly, that it was a very large house cat, not a bobcat. And that is by far the most typical reported sighting that we get having to do with bobcats here in New Jersey. It's almost always, not always, but almost always a mistaken identity. And it's often a very large house cat. It could be a dog seen from a distance that just has that coloration and a certain body shape and size. Could be a fox. And there's a number of different mammals. Some say fishers are often, not often, but can be mistaken for bobcats. The biggest thing to remember is in many of these sightings, this office park maybe notwithstanding, in many of the other sightings are typically someone's driving down a road along a wooded area, and they get that quick glimpse, a flash of movement, and maybe they really get something that makes them think it's a bobcat. Or you're out on a trail somewhere, and around a bend, you get that quick glimpse. uh, it's easy to say, how could someone think a bobcat is a dog? That makes no sense. But when you're seeing something in the wild from a distance and it's just a quick passing moment, your mind can run with it. And there could be certain angles where it certainly does appear to be a bobcat, but it's not. And again, that is our most typical reported sighting. Here is I thought it was an inspiring story at a power line easement up in Morris County a couple of years ago. PSE&G workers were doing kind of brush clearing to keep the power lines free, from disruption, and they came upon a den of nearly newborn bobcat kittens. Imagine that. Imagine coming upon that. You're in your day-to-day routine, and all of a sudden stumbling upon a bobcat den. They reported it immediately to the state DEP. DEP sent someone out. They stopped work immediately. Ultimately, what appeared to have happened was that the bobcat parent returned and brought the cats out of there, and essentially got the kittens out of there once that disruption had occurred. Moved them to a safer den. Um, there was never anything further found in a negative way to make us think that the kittens were left behind or injured in any way. So that was a positive story. From everything we could tell, a happy outcome, at least in the sense that the cat got to find a new place and move on its way. And certainly, anytime you have people stumbling upon a den, there's the risk of really negative outcome for the bobcats. In this case, there wasn't, thankfully. Here is the kind of outcome that should be avoided at all costs with any kind of wildlife, but particularly with a animal that is strong and powerful. Even though it's not huge by human standards, it certainly has power, and it's a meat-eating carnivore, um, and a wild animal. What happened was about a year ago now, a little over a year ago, in Colorado, a woman driving with a young child in the back seat um, hit a bobcat accidentally. Went out, saw the bobcat seemed to have its back legs broken or immobilized in whatever way, and so far so good. But then the best thing and only thing to do at that point is call the authorities, let a trained animal handler, either from the town, from the state, if you're in a national park or state park, let somebody like that handle it. She did not do that. She instead put the bobcat physically in the back of her truck. And to make matters worse, there was no separation between the bobcat and her young child in the back seat. Thankfully, the bobcat did not attack or the child. There was no harm done. But when ultimately, when the woman did bring this to a park official, the official said it literally, and never in her whole life did she ever imagine opening a car door to someone who had put a wild carnivore in the car with her young child. Um, it was absolutely a miracle that nothing happened. And again, wild animals, we do not want to take any chances of safety issues for us or them. As it happens, the bobcat was paralyzed in the back legs and ultimately did have to be euthanized. So that was sad, but it could have been so much more dangerous and devastating. And this is also this is one of the few examples where we have here in New Jersey where we did have a bobcat encounter go awry. Again, we've been fortunate in New Jersey, no injuries, no attacks, anything like that directly where a person got attacked. But we did have a rabid bobcat. This was about 3 years ago in Morris County, who entered a garage and threatened a homeowner further down the block in the same afternoon. And again, it had rabies, and the only time, uh, almost without exception, anywhere in the country, the only time you ever have any kind of negative bobcat human encounters is either because the bobcat is surprised or approached by the humans in a way it shouldn't be, or in the case of this cat, where it's a sick or injured cat who's clearly not in its right mind. Again, fortunate nobody was injured. I will say, unlike some other wild carnivores in North America, we have had virtually no bobcat encounters with humans that have approached, fatalities or anything like that. So we've been very fortunate that way, but also knowing the bobcat's behavior, it's not surprising either. And finally, among the encounters, I'll leave you with the in my mind the most positive of all. It's a totally you know an encounter with no real end result, but just a bobcat passing through. This is from a year ago in Sussex County, just kind of wandering through a backyard. The person got some photos. The newspaper ran a little, nice little feel good story about a bobcat in its own habitat on the edge of uh, on the edge of a wild area, just kind of making its rounds. No human interaction and no negatives in any direction. Just a beautiful moment for the person who was able to observe it and catch a couple cool photos. And so the bobcat. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of greater context. We've seen a little bit about our typical interactions, at least as we perceive them, and as they're reported, as we hear about them. But what about the cat itself, kind of separate from people? Well, the bobcat has one of the greatest ranges of just about any land animal in North America. It's essentially, if you overlap the bobcat's range, it's you can take the whole continental U.S., not Alaska, but the whole continental U.S. And other than some spots in the Midwest and a few other smaller areas, it more or less blankets the whole continental U.S. Um, the southern edge of Canada, for the most part, right, within 100 to 200 miles of the border, you can still find bobcats, and for much of Mexico as well, um, you can find bobcats. And what does this really mean? This means that for bobcats to be able to live in that whole area, it means they've been able to adapt to a tremendous range of habitats. Everything from the Northeast forests that we're used to here in New Jersey, to Rocky Mountain type habitats along the spine, Colorado, Wyoming, to desert habitats in the Southwest, to more kind of swampy lowland type habitats down in the Southeast. It can handle all of that. So very adaptive animal. Um, Appearance wise, well, how can you tell it? I mentioned about the misidentifications. There's three main things to look for. One of them is, as its name indicates, it's bobbed tail. It's usually around 3-4 inches long, so it's not tiny, but it's good enough that you'll notice it, and you'll notice that, hey, where's the rest of that tail? Um, that's number one. Number two, its size. It's about twice the size of uh, 2 to 3 times the size of a typical house cat. Really, you're talking about 15 to 25 pounds. Males being larger. Those are a couple differentiations between a bobcat and a typical house cat. Of course, the tufted ears. Almost all bobcats have black tufts at the top of their ears that stick up, and very noticeable and very unique. Lynx have similar, but lynx we don't have here in New Jersey. We've only had one documented sighting in the last 5 decades. So if you're seeing anything with tufted ears of a sizable nature as a wild cat, it is a bobcat here in New Jersey. Um, Appearance-wise, they range quite a bit, though, their actual coats. The beautiful coats and nice, healthy, and rich coats, they tend to be anywhere mixed from rosettes to spots to even some striping at different ages and different individual cats. And the colors range from kind of a gray to a tawny to a reddish type uh, coat to a dark brown. So you kind of have a range there, probably the most common being similar to what you see in that photo as the most common of the colorations for bobcats. Their senses are extraordinary. They have tremendous vision, and their hearing is also excellent, both of which add quite a bit to their ability to hunt. And we're going to talk in a moment about some of the creatures they do hunt. But both of those are real assets for them when they are on the prowl. They're also very agile, athletic animals. They can swim. They also have padding on the bottom of their feet that they can walk virtually silently. So uh, the combination of being agile and quick with also being able to stalk up quietly on their prey makes them a formidable foe for a range of prey. And I mentioned the rabbit earlier. The rabbits are probably their I don't want to say their favorite dish because maybe each bobcat has their own tastes, but probably their most common dish is the rabbit. But their prey ranges widely, everything from mice and chipmunks up to woodchucks to other kind of mid-sized mammals. Occasionally, they'll also eat fish as well when they can catch fish. But for the most part, they'll even eat insects um, and amphibians and reptiles. So it really does go across the board. Occasionally, an injured deer, injured or young deer. They're not going to go out kind of looking for deer as a common prey, but they will, if they do kind of have that opportunity comes up to get a deer rather, more in its range, whether due to injury or size, they will take that opportunity. And as to its lifestyle, bobcats like to move around quite a bit. So other than when they're denning, these are animals that really cover quite a bit of ground. Um, you're looking at maybe 10 square miles in a given day um, for the typical bobcat. Males tend to move more than females, but not only. Females also move quite a bit, as we'll see an example shortly. So I mentioned when they're denning, things are a little different. Well, the uh, the denning usually happens in the summer. Um, in the spring or summer, I should say. Bobcats breed as early as February and as late as June. It's usually about 2 months gestation, and bobcats look for any kind of secure area. So they look to get under maybe in holes in under rocks and boulders, um, in under logs or trees. They're a root mass under a tree. Whatever gives them that kind of feeling of security and shelter. Um, those are ideal for them to raise their young. And it's usually about 1 to 6 cats. 2 to 3 is the most common amount of kittens. Um, for the first 3 months, they're completely helpless. They're weaned on the mother's milk. Um, what happens then is really, for me, it's really cool. The bobcat mom will start out maybe around 3 months by then starting to bring first dead prey. So picture a dead mouse. as a way for the bobcat kitten to start getting off the pure dependence on the mother. So they start out with the dead prey, but then maybe within a few weeks or a month, they now start bringing live mice to get the young kittens, start to get them comfortable hunting. So even if they're hunting just within the den area, with probably with help from mom, they're starting to get their feet under them, so to speak. And by around 5 months, they're out actually then participating in hunts, and maybe not so successful early on, but they learn quickly. They learn. They join the mom in these hunts, and within a few months, they are actually independent. As young as 8 months, the bobcat we first saw today, BC, was probably around 8 or 9 months. It was a younger, independent bobcat, probably just out on his own. Um, but somewhere in that 8 to 12 months is when they typically become independent. I mentioned earlier that the males tend to roam more than the females, but uh, the greatest record we have is actually from a female bobcat who was, as a young cat, just newly independent, was tagged, GPS tagged in late 2014 in just east of the Delaware Water Gap along the Highlands region in New Jersey. And just 2 years later, was found again through its tag 108 miles away, over towards Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, uh, to get there. And that's 108 miles as a straight line, which bobcats certainly do not run in a straight line, particularly in this part of the country. So it had to cross, this female bobcat had to cross the Delaware River and three major interstate highways to get there over the span of those 2 years. Absolutely remarkable. Much more than the typical range, which again, I said they're constantly on the move, but it's more typical within a 6 to 25 mile radius. So the bobcat, what one of the things that makes it special is that we probably did lose it entirely. It was thought that we did. We may have had a few hanging on, which I'll explain in a moment. But while the bobcat originally was found throughout the state, and again, especially in the northwestern half, um, it had declined by levels over time, and so the initial decline, of course, really came during the colonial days when we lost most of our other major predators in the Northeast. We lost the mountain lion, we lost the gray wolf, um, black bear numbers were sharply cut, um, and we lost some other mammals like elk as well. So we lost a lot of wildlife then, and it was a combination of overhunting, and especially land clearing at the time, as we cleared land for farms and for villages and towns. So bobcats had their numbers drop in the colonial days, and then again in the early 1900s, their numbers dropped again as development continued across the state. And by the mid 50s, they were starting to really become few and far between, seldom seen. By the 60s, they were believed to be extirpated from the state. Uh, around that time, they had been moved to having a game status, meaning they couldn't just be indiscriminately hunted. It was more, a code around it, and numbers set for what they could be hunted. That helped, but the damage was already done. Their numbers had dropped so low that they were feared to be extirpated or lost entirely from a certain area, in this case, New Jersey. Um, and what we found was that, uh, let me back up a moment. So by the late 70s, with here we are in a state that we believed had no bobcats for the 70s, basically. Um, Scientists took bobcats from Maine, 24 bobcats they brought in from the interior of Maine, very rugged and remote area, and brought them in to be reintroduced, around four a year. It wasn't all at once. It was around four a year, and it was up in the most rugged and remote part of New Jersey, in the Sussex and northern Passaic County region along the border of New York and Pennsylvania. And so releasing these around 4 each year for a 5-year period gave the bobcats a jump start. What was nice at the time was and not in the way we would like to have found it, but there was a couple of bobcats that were found, uh, roadkill bobcats, and I shouldn't say nice at the time. It was information that let us know these weren't bobcats that were had been reintroduced. So finding them let us know that there was some kind of remnant population, even though they were thought to be gone entirely. There was probably a couple hanging on. And so New Jersey, through the reintroduction, which was very successful, you have the reintroduced bobcats from Maine. You have whatever remnant population who that hung on from New Jersey, and then you also have, because of our location, especially in the northwestern part of the state, you have bobcats occasionally making their way in from New York, ultimately coming largely from the Catskills or the Adirondacks or New England on the longer trips, and coming from Pennsylvania to the west. So, in a sense, New Jersey has been this melting pot of bobcats, and that matters. I'll come to in a moment, but it gives it genetic diversity. It's not all just one population, which you risk a lot of health issues when it's just a single population without having genetic diversity. And so, the ways we know about bobcats are through trying to get as much information over the decades as we could on individual cats, and thus get a better understand their population. I will say bobcats are among the toughest species, large species we work with in New Jersey to understand the populations because they're so reclusive. They really do stay out of our way, and it's tough to know real numbers. I can remember around nearly a decade ago, asking in what was otherwise a very open and frank discussion around the time of my book, Wild New Jersey, asking a wildlife official, what do you estimate? Understanding that it'll be some kind of range in New Jersey, what do you estimate the population to be? And he thought about it for a moment and said, well, I can say it would be more than 100 and less than 1,000. um, well, thank you for narrowing that down. That certainly gives us a tiny window there to, but that actually reflected what was known at the time. We have a little better understanding now that it's probably a few hundred, but the way we have that understanding is through tracking. So initially, in the late '90s and early 2000s, radio collars, um, they were very effective, but they're very high maintenance. They require people to be out with telemetry, with transmitters going into that area and trying to pick up the signal to find out where the cat is. So it requires a lot of field time. One of the interesting alternate approaches we learned was tracking dogs, and in particular, New Jersey was blessed to have a tracker, a dog named Bear, and you can see from the picture, was a massive dog. So from 2005 to 2017, Bear, uh, who was a mix of a Chow and a couple other breeds, really truly built. They were raised in Montana, raised for tracking, and really felt at his best when he was out in the field tracking. He tracked bobcats, he tracked snakes, he tracked a number of different at-risk species here in New Jersey, working with Gretchen Fowles and the Endangered Non-Game Species Program. And Bear located signs from 21 bobcats in the very first winter, 2005. And so the amount of info that Bear was able to, and Bear was looking for scat, Bear was looking for signs, any kind of signs of bobcats. And what was great is that it would also get genetic information. So when the glamorous part of the biologist's job is, you find scat, it actually has a wealth of information when you're dealing with species like bobcats. And for those of you who just love that topic, uh, if you ever find something in the woods and you're trying to find what it is, the internet is great for at least the more reputable sites like this one, finding how to identify, is this bobcat, is this something else, is it porcupine or otter, or coyote or whatever else it may be. The In terms of the tracks, the best way to differentiate bobcats from coyotes or just dogs when you come across a track on a trail is you don't see those front claw prints. As a cat, the retractable claws obviously much bigger than a house cat print, more in line with a coyote or a regular sized, large sized dog, but again, without those claw prints. So if you're seeing that kind of classic shape you see in the right image there, then you could be looking at potentially a bobcat print. In recent years, one of the best ways to identify both bobcats and other very reclusive animals is trail cams. We've seen that with Fisher. We've seen that with a number of species we didn't even know if we had them in New Jersey. But trail cams and motion cams strategically placed in the wild go a long way. Here you have an image that documented bobcats back in Mercer County 3 years ago. It was the first documented photo, even though there were reports, it hadn't been documented until this trail photo. So they do a wealth of good, both for bobcats and many other species. And lastly, GPS collars have replaced radio collars as, excuse me, as a great way for getting data and information about wild animals, particularly those that move a lot, like the bobcat. Through GPS collars, we can get the signals remotely. We don't have to have a scientist out there in the field, stumbling up and down mountain slopes to try to get close enough to pick up the signal. We can get it all remotely. And as you can see here, here's 4 different bobcats over the period of about a year and a half. All the different motion, all the different kind of daily check-ins from their signal, and you can see they have their kind of range that they move around quite a bit within that range. What I'll come back to in a moment, you might notice that the red lines being some of our major roadways. Outside of that light pink symbol, all the others tended to stay on mostly on one side of these major roadways. The light pink one obviously found some kind of uh, underpass or overpass on Route 80, which we'll come back to in a moment what that means. So here, just kind of looking at the big picture for both bobcats and some of our other terrestrial animals, we've seen an absolutely mind-blowing amount of habitat loss here in New Jersey as development has made our suburbs ever larger and our sprawl ever greater. Um, this means those roadways have really started to become major barriers for a number of species. Bobcats are kind of that signature species, though. They're a larger species comparatively. They move around quite a bit. They need to move around as part of their kind of day-to-day lives, and they're at in such a way that they're very much at risk of being hit by vehicles. So again, here you see some individual cats. Each color is a different individual cat, and you see the roads really do act as barriers. They're either unwilling or unable to cross many of those roads. Again, individual cats can occasionally cross one, but for the most part, with the one on the other side being the exception to the rule, the other ones tend to stay on one side or the other because they don't want to risk death. To give you an idea of movement too, here just up at the Delaware Water Gap, going from north of Route 80 all the way up to High Point State Park and then back down on the other side of the ridge. This is just a single male moving around 50 miles in the last 9 months of the year. And it's relatively commonplace, to have that kind of movement. These are animals that were kind of born to run. And I mentioned they're very much at risk of being hit. And just like that individual cat BC that we talked about up front, BC was under a year old. Almost all the cats that are hit, all the bobcats that are hit by cars, are either 0 or 1 years old, under 1 year old, or in that 1 to 2 range. Once they get older, they're smarter. As just like humans, they get wiser as they get older in theory. But they're very much at risk. They're out exploring. They're kind of newly independent, and they're still learning what they need to be worried about out there in the wild. Here you have over a 12-year period all the different road mortality bobcats, all the bobcats found as roadkill, killed by vehicles. And you can see almost all of them are north of Route 80. You have a smaller number south of Route 80, going all the way down to Route 78, being the kind of the furthest south from that period. Now, that being said, the vast majority of our population is in that window, west of Route 287, north of Route 78, and especially north of Route 80. But there have been sightings all throughout the state, and probably at least a good portion of them are legitimate. So it uh, can be assumed that there's a reasonable chance to see a bobcat in any of the wilder areas of the state, as long as they're connected to other wild habitat. If they're isolated, it's much less likely. But I'll explain what that means as we go on. And here you see just kind of a year to year, the number of bobcats killed. What this really, the reason I show this is because while year to year it goes up and down, the greater trend is slightly increasing over time, which is bad for the individual cats, but it's a good sign of the overall population. It reflects what we've seen in the field, which is that we are reasonably confident there's been a slow but steady increase in population of bobcats over the last few decades. And some of the statistics like this do reflect that. This is just a fancy chart that essentially says um, as the roads get busier, they either become barriers in the sense that animals no longer try to cross them, or that they just become death traps. And unfortunately, in New Jersey, we have 39,000 miles of roadway, um, and it's no shortage. There's no shortage of potential, um, you know, death traps for bobcats and other wildlife. I mentioned earlier about genetic diversity as well. This gives you an example. It's a different species, but it gives you an example of what I'm talking about with bobcats. Uh, as these roadways create these barriers, you isolate populations. And once the populations are isolated for too long, they lose that genetic diversity. Another good example would be the Florida panther, which long ago was separated from the rest of mountain lions or pumas or cougars, whichever word you want to use, um, that are spread out around much of the country. Florida panthers were isolated, and as a result, you started to see major health problems in the small and dwindling population that was then under 100 cats. Ultimately, a few years ago, some of the park officials brought in Texas mountain lions and released them in the same Florida panther habitat to try to start rebuilding that genetic diversity, because you really were seeing health impacts starting to put their future very much in doubt. So I mentioned the negative in terms of habitat loss. Well, the positive in New Jersey is that at the same time we've been losing so much habitat, we've also been preserving quite a bit of open space. And so now we have about a third of the state preserved, which in a state like ours is no small task. Number one, it's harder to navigate those kind of preservations in a state where you have over 500 municipalities. Makes us very unique in that we have so much local rule, and yet we still manage to preserve about a third of the state. It's just about no other state in east of the Mississippi mirrors that to preserving that much percentage of our state's natural habitat. And so the that's the good news. The challenge now is, well, how do we connect that habitat? How do we really make it function the way it's intended to? And historically, not just in New Jersey but anywhere across the world, the approach has for the past century has been big national parks, right? You think Yellowstone, you think Serengeti, you think these kind of, you protect this big national park. That was the concept, and then you that protects everything in it. And in theory, that could work in the short term. But what happened is everything around it then you would be at risk, and so you get these isolated locations that no longer were kind of dynamic. You no longer had wildlife being able to connect in and out of corridors. And New Jersey, that's what has become a new priority, at least in the conservation area, is connecting habitat. Um, and it could be larger scale, like above highways, like we talked about. it could be smaller scale. You look at amphibians and reptiles getting under some major roadways that go in their areas connecting their wintering grounds with the vernal pools that they depend on to build the next generation. They have to make these migrations every spring. They do amphibians early spring. Frogs and salamanders go by thousands, often crossing roads that where you could lose in the span of a few rainy nights, you could lose half the population if there's not protections. And so in places like here, River Road in um, Bernardsville, you have underpasses that allow them to cross safely. You're seeing this a lot across North America too. In Montana, you now have dozens of overpasses on the major east-west interstate that allows everything from mountain lions and bobcats to black bears and elk and moose and white-tailed deer are all able to use it. Um, you see that in Europe as well. You're starting to see it more and more. In New England, you're starting to see these overpasses across highways. On the continental scale, people really thinking big are thinking, well, how do we connect these larger scales in a similar? It's almost the wildlife version of the Appalachian Trail for humans. Well, when you look at how much the continent has been developed, and again, these are wildly ambitious. It's nothing that is being put into place right now as a whole, but it's a good way to think about kind of reconnecting habitats and wildlife viability through different ecosystems as much as you can. And we've been fortunate to have a lot of protected areas already that give us a starting point towards some of that. Um, on the global scale, you see it in places like India, where you have Asian rhinos and tigers and Asian elephants being able to connect from otherwise two very disparate locations, blocked by a majorly urbanized and fast-growing areas. In Europe, in Dutch, along the Dutch coast, you have overpasses that help badgers and a number of other European mammals cross over. Um, Two of my favorites in Oslo, Norway, you have a pollinator corridor, where they actually have given incentives, even in the city, for pollinator. Everything from beehives and other different feeders, different plants, native plants, put out along this corridor to actually create a pollinator corridor within the city. I think it's such a creative idea and so easy to replicate elsewhere with with the right buy-in from local towns or officials. Um, and my favorite of all is in Christmas Island. Land crabs have a migration once a year where they basically all head down to the coast. And so rather than have them become, grist under the passing cars, they created this overpass. Can you imagine wandering on your walk to work or if you're visiting as a tourist and walking past something like that, so far it looks like something out of a cartoon. So bringing it back to New Jersey, though, well, one of the things that the state priority in working with Conserve Wildlife Foundation and a number of other groups is kind of putting this priority on connecting these habitats. And so change is connecting habitat across New Jersey, um, and it's a totally voluntary program, but it's something that is aimed to give incentives to towns and counties and local landowners to try to help rebuild these corridors. And it could be putting in these little underpasses or overpasses, or simply revegetating areas or protecting certain areas that connect larger ones. And you see black bear is another good example. Just like bobcats, they range widely across major areas of the state, different habitats, and everything from quail and wood turtle, box turtle, a number of different frogs and salamanders, and of course northern pine snake. All would benefit from this kind of connectivity. And again, it is something considered voluntary. It's not a mandatory requirement, but it is something that, for instance, when towns or states or counties are fixing up roadways, as an example, here's an overpass. If you see the image on the left, the before image, no wildlife will use that. Why? Because there's no dry land. It's just water. It's so that to them looks dangerous. They're just not going to use it. Instead, they try to cross over the road and risk being hit. You see a better example to the right, the after image. It has dry beds on either side of the stream, and that's safe for wildlife. They will use it, and it keeps them off the roads. The most ambitious program like this we have here in New Jersey is the Nature Conservancy's Bobcat Alley program, which is seeks to put many hundreds of acres long term to protect many hundreds of acres in northwest New Jersey, connecting the Highlands region to the Delaware Water Gap region. Uh, right now, it's all mostly all privately owned in very small parcels. It's about a third preserved right now, and the goal of the Nature Conservancy is to protect another third in the next 10 years, and ultimately connect these two regions that are very, very heavily preserved, but they're right now kind of separated in so many ways. And so, for a species like the bobcat, being able to safely navigate between these great habitats goes a long way. I mentioned earlier about some of the things not to do. I used the example, the Colorado woman who put the bobcat in the car. We never want anything like that. What do we really want to do, though? We want to make sure we don't feed wildlife. We don't want to habituate wildlife to, and I don't mean a bird feeder. I'm talking about like truly feeding wildlife. You don't want to feed any kind of wild animals that make them habituated to your wild mammals. We'll say that make them see your yard in a way that they become habituated. And the bears, bobcats, coyotes, you don't want them relying on the pet food you leave outside. That's when you can have dangerous incidents occur. Um, Likewise, if you are fortunate enough to see a wild animal, and you're admiring it, you want to keep your distance. A couple of good rules of thumb that I like to think of: if you're getting close enough that they react to your presence, then that means you're probably getting too close. If they're going about doing their own thing, then that's a good sign. That means you're probably staying far enough. But once they start reacting to you, then and it could be snorting, pawing the ground, in some way starting to seem antsy or nervous around your presence. It means you're too close. Give some distance. Um, Another good, and this one's a literal rule of thumb. If you're out and you're seeing a wild animal, like again a bear or bobcat being a good example, hold your arm out, and it should really be about the size of your thumb. It shouldn't be big. If it's bigger than that, that means you're also probably too close. You want to keep your distance and enjoy the moment without risking that the wildlife flees in abject terror, or worse, that feels threatened and does something outside of its typical reaction, and sees you as a threat. Either way, it's not something you want to take any chances. And bobcats, I mentioned, are a threatened and endangered species here in New Jersey. When you do see one in the wild, if you're ever lucky enough to, report it. Let us know. You can certainly let our organization know, or you can also let the state know. We're in the process of putting up new online reporting information. Right now, there's a state form. You can just do a Google search to find the state form for reporting a bobcat sighting. If you come across any dead or injured bobcats, there's the hotline, the DEP hotline, 1-877-WARN-DEP. That's a good number to call right away for anything that is, either especially an injured bobcat, but also even a dead one, because it's still information that helps us in our long-term planning for protecting bobcats. And then to end it with just literally a photo just designed to pull your heartstrings. You have these incredible kittens, about as cute as it gets, adorable as it gets. And I'd like to close with just, mentioning a few things that you can do to help wildlife like bobcats here in New Jersey and elsewhere. Of course, we elections are always uh, a preeminent way to do that. Uh, but also beyond that, advocating for stronger bills protecting wildlife, is particularly in certain areas, pollinators and others. Volunteering. I know it's tough right now with COVID, but especially once more volunteer openings are available again, getting out in the field. There's nothing better than that. Getting out in the field and doing something hands-on with wildlife or with habitat, whether it's with our organization, Conserve Wildlife Foundation, or so many others that do great work. That's a great way to help wildlife. Also, just doing things in your own yard. It could be in your yard. It could be in your community, or at your church, or at your workplace, at your school. Putting up things like bird feeders, bat and bird boxes, native plantings go so far for pollinators and for the whole food web. Each of those things, I can't stress enough, is such a great uh, way to kind of contribute and help wildlife come back. And of course, our as a nonprofit, we always depend on support. So consider, making a donation, whether to Conserve Wildlife Foundation or any other groups doing work like this with wildlife. Um, I thank you so much for your time tonight, and I am happy to recommend our website. Has detailed field guides on bobcats, as well as on all the threatened and endangered species in New Jersey. We also have webcams on bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and ospreys that give you throughout the year, even whether it's live through the nesting season, and even right now you have great highlights from the last nesting season. Check us out, conservewildlifenj.org, and I hope you'll visit us there. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our organization. And thank you again to Cape May County Library and to all of you for listening tonight. Take care.